They still talk about the summer of 1938 in Marlowe's Ford, a small farming town tucked between soft, rolling plains and a railroad track that seemed to stretch into forever. Not many people live there now. Those who remain say the town started dying the same year Maisie Lorne disappeared. Not because the town grieved her, but because it refused to. The Lorne family worked the rail freight yard, not glamorous work, but steady. Her father, Walter Lorne, ran the night loading crew. Her mother stitched dresses from home. Maisie was 14, small for her age, quiet, observant, and often found reading in the dusty corner of Old Alder's General Store while her mother shopped. People like to say Marlowe's Ford was the sort of place where nothing bad happens. But that was a lie they told outsiders, because bad things did happen. The town didn't talk about them, especially not about the men behind the storehouse. Everyone knew who they were, and everyone pretended they didn't. Behind Alder's General Store stood a long, low building originally used to keep grain dry before shipment. By the 1930s, it had become a private storage shed for rail workers. At night, lanterns glowed inside. Some said that was where the men drank, gambled, and told stories. Others whispered that more went on, things women warned their daughters about without naming. The storehouse belonged unofficially to the freight crew, 5 men led by Carson Burke, a man who had lived his whole life in Marlowe's Ford and treated the town like it belonged to him. Big, red-faced, and always carrying a half-chewed cigar between his teeth. He was the sheriff's cousin, which alone was enough to make most people look the other way. Maisie had been warned to stay clear of the place, but when your father works the rail yard, the rails become a second home, and children, especially quiet ones, wander. What happened the night Maisie disappeared is known only in pieces, fragments whispered by people too scared to speak fully or too guilty to admit they saw something but did nothing. What is certain is that on a hot August evening, as the freight yard glowed orange in the setting sun, Maisie was seen walking toward Alder's store, a book tucked under her arm. She never came home. Her mother raised the alarm before midnight. Walter Lorne gathered his crew, lanterns swinging as they fanned out across the rail yard. It wasn't long before people joined, neighbors, tired farm hands, all wearing the same expression. We know what this is. We know where she might be. But we don't want to be the ones to find it. They found nothing the first night. The second night either. By the third, the sheriff made a show of taking statements, though anyone watching could see he had already decided the case was a runaway. But Maisie Lorne was not the runaway type. She was the type who apologized for taking too long at the library. Her mother refused to stop searching. Walter, gray-faced from lack of sleep, continued working his nightly shifts, because he had to. Because in towns like Marlowe's Ford, grief did not exempt a man from labor. 3 weeks passed, and then, one morning, the storehouse behind Alder's burned down. Accident, they said. Faulty lantern, nothing to see there, except the fire burned too evenly, too completely. And people noticed that the men who usually drank there had taken the night off. There was a story passed among the wives and mothers, but only ever whispered, never spoken aloud near the sheriff. Someone said they saw a scrap of blue cloth in the ashes that looked like the hem of Maisie's Sunday dress. Someone else claimed they had heard shouting from the storehouse the night she vanished, men's voices and a girl's scream cut short. A teenage boy swore he had seen Burke and 2 of his crew outside the storehouse door around sunset with something wrapped in burlap. But every person who tried to speak to the sheriff changed their mind the next day. People claimed they had been mistaken, or not thinking clearly, or that they had heard wrong, because the sheriff had a way of leaning too close when he talked, letting the weight of his badge do the threatening for him. Maisie was never found, and the story might have ended there, buried under the town's silence, if not for what happened the following spring. Rail workers still talk about the night Walter came in early for a shift inspection. He had been thinner since the disappearance, with a hollow look around his eyes that aging men tend to get only after a long illness or a long grief. He was quieter than usual, calmer even, too calm. He walked the length of the freight yard with his lantern, checking bolts and rail lines, not speaking to anyone. A few men tried to offer condolences, but he nodded without much interest. Later, some of them admitted that Walter had seemed almost detached from the world, like someone who had finally made a decision. Around midnight, he told his crew he needed to check something out by the far siding. That siding ran right behind Alder's General Store. He didn't come back for an hour, then 2, then 3. At dawn, they found him walking back toward the yard, clothes dusty, eyes red, not from tears but from smoke. Behind him, faint on the horizon, was the rising plume of another fire. Carson Burke's house burned to the ground before sunrise. The fire brigade claimed the blaze had started in the kitchen. People whispered that was nonsense. Burke barely used his kitchen, living off beer and food bought at the rail canteen. Burke and one of his crew were found dead inside. 2 others never showed up to work again. The sheriff questioned people, loudly insisting the fire was a terrible accident. But the townsfolk exchanged looks behind his back. Everyone knew, and yet no one said a word. Walter arrived home later that day, exhausted. When his wife tried to ask him where he had been, he simply said, "I finished my shift," and nothing more. He slept for nearly 20 hours. 7. The town's divide. The Burke fire didn't heal Marlowe's Ford. If anything, it cracked it open. Some believed Walter had finally gotten justice for Maisie, justice the law refused to give. They admired him quietly, with the kind of respect reserved for men who do what others are too frightened to do. Others believed revenge was a dangerous thing, even when justified, and feared what it meant for the town's sense of order. If a man could take justice into his own hands once, he could do it again. The sheriff investigated for months, but found nothing solid. People said he knew exactly what had happened, but couldn't prove it, or worse, didn't dare prove it. Burke might have been his cousin, but the rest of the town outnumbered him, and he could feel their judgment like heat on the back of his neck. In winter, Walter quietly transferred to a freight line 3 towns away. He and his wife packed what little they had and left before dawn without goodbyes. No one stopped them. No one dared. Some said Walter didn't want to live in a place that had swallowed his daughter. Others whispered he was fleeing from what he had done, but no one knew the truth. In the spring thaw of 1940, 2 years after Maisie disappeared, a boy hunting rabbits behind the old store lot found something buried under a dead elm tree. A shallow grave, human remains, torn fabric, blue as Sunday dresses, and a locket that Maisie's mother had sewn into her collar to keep her safe. The town gathered around the site in stunned silence. The sheriff aged 10 years in an afternoon. The county coroner declared the remains consistent with a young girl, but the body was too decomposed to determine the exact cause of death. Everyone knew it was Maisie. Everyone also knew Burke's crew had killed her, and everyone knew Walter had burned Burke alive for it, but no one said anything officially. The sheriff quietly closed the investigation. Maisie was buried in the town cemetery under a white stone that read only, "Maisie Lorne, 1924 to 1938, home at last." Years later, in the 1950s, long after the Lornes had left and the freight yard began to rust, a letter surfaced. It was found inside an old rail locker purchased at auction when the yard closed down. Inside the locker was a folded piece of paper wrapped in cloth. "To whoever finds this, I did what any father would do. I know the law won't call it justice, but the law didn't look for my girl. If you think me wrong, so be it. I finished what they started when they buried her. If I burn in hell, at least I will find her there and hold her again. W. Lorne." Its authenticity was never proven. Some say Walter really wrote it. Some say someone forged it as a cautionary tale. Some say it was left by a man drowning in guilt. Some say it was left by a man who felt none at all. No one knows. What is known is this: the Burke family line ended with Carson's death. The sheriff resigned a year later. Alder's store closed in 1942. The storehouse was never rebuilt, and Maisie's parents lived out their lives somewhere far away, in a quiet town where no one whispered about storehouses, freight crews, or fires that burned too clean. As for Walter, some claim he lived a peaceful life afterward. Some claim he drank himself numb. Some claim he died in his sleep, untroubled. Others claim, quietly, almost fearfully, that men like him never truly rest. What happened in Marlowe's Ford will never be recorded in a history book. It exists only in memory, in whispers carried along the rusting tracks, in stories told by old men who swear the past never really dies. The crime was never officially solved. The revenge was never officially recorded. But everyone knew the truth. And the only unanswered question, the one that keeps the story alive, is this: did Walter Lorne avenge his daughter? Or did he simply create another ghost for the town to bury? No one knows, and no one ever will. Some questions never find answers, and maybe they aren't meant to. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, don't forget to like, comment, and hit subscribe.